The other day, I explained the model of sustainable economic development based on genuine saving, and I illustrated it with different triangular charts of the productive structure. In contrast, I explained the model of artificial credit expansion based on growth in the money supply. Although this second model initially seems to have the same effects, the fact that it rests on money creation and not on real saving means that sooner or later, 6 effects appear and reverse the process, giving rise first to a financial crisis and later to an economic recession. So, now please open your books to page 397 of the English edition of Money, Bank Credit and Economic Cycles. And we will see why, if new investment is financed with real, genuine prior saving rather than with credit expansion, there is no economic crisis. If new investments in the productive stages furthest from consumption are financed with prior saving and not with credit expansion, we observe none of the 6 microeconomic effects which we studied the day before yesterday, and which inevitably reverse expansion and trigger a crisis. We are going to review these effects together, and we will be convinced that they do not appear if everything is financed with real saving. As you recall, the first effect we considered was growth in the prices of the factors of production. Why do these prices rise? Because the new money banks create in the form of deposits is injected into the system as loans given to entrepreneurs, who use that new purchasing power to demand productive factors and draw them to their investment projects. Since those factors are not freed from the sector of consumption, entrepreneurs can attract them only by paying higher prices, and therefore the prices of the factors of production, of labor and raw materials, tend to gradually increase. Well, this first effect does not appear if all investment is financed with real saving. While it is true that entrepreneurs demand productive factors, it is no less true that, as you remember, saving involves restricting immediate consumption. So the sales of the companies near to consumption suffer. They decrease, and with them the prices of consumer goods. The companies devoted to producing these goods become sluggish. They are forced to let go of labor, capital equipment, and other productive factors, which are freed in the market and thus increase in supply. As a result, they can be transferred to the stages furthest from consumption without any rise in price. There is a greater demand, but there is also a greater supply. The two effects balance out, and therefore the price of productive factors does not go up. The second effect, which occurs temporarily and tends to halt the speculative bubble process based on credit expansion, is as follows. Once entrepreneurs pay workers and owners of the other original means of production, capital goods, etc., and the newly created money reaches the pockets of consumers in a second, third or fourth wave, if they use that additional purchasing power to buy consumer goods, then the price of consumer goods tends to climb. This is especially true if, as we saw, the arrival of consumer goods in the market also slows down somewhat due to numerous bottlenecks, which occur when entrepreneurs devote great effort to more capital-intensive industries that will mature in the form of consumer goods in a more distant future. Well, this second effect does not appear either if investment is financed with saving. And what do we mean by saving? We said that saving meant the sacrifice or the discipline of postponing into a more distant future the achievement of our ends, the giving up of immediate consumption. Therefore, if there is saving, there is less consumption. So people demand fewer consumer goods, and there is no force to push up the price of those consumer goods. Quite the opposite. As we have just seen, it remains stable or falls. That is why the second effect we talked about does not occur. And, as a result, the third effect does not occur either. What was the third effect which halted the process of credit expansion? A disparity in profits. It turns out that if there is credit expansion, profits eventually tend to grow in the companies closest to consumption, where prices rise at a faster rate than those of production goods. Well, when the whole process is financed with genuine saving, this disparity in profits does not arise. Actually, it does arise, but in the opposite direction. In other words, saving means less consumption, which pushes down the profits of companies close to consumption and pushes up those of companies further from consumption. A sign tells entrepreneurs they are doing the right thing if they lengthen the productive structure and make it more capital intensive, because they will be able to complete their projects in a sustainable manner, since citizens are willing to make the sacrifice involved in prior, genuine saving. And what about the fourth effect, the Ricardo effect, which also tends to put a stop to the process of credit expansion? Well, when the prices of consumer goods increase, because the new money has reached the pockets of consumers, real wages drop. And this tells entrepreneurs they should hire workers at the margin instead of capital equipment. As a result, there is no longer enough demand for those newly created companies far from consumption, which are devoted to producing capital equipment. If the entire process rests on investment financed with genuine saving, the Ricardo effect operates, but in the opposite direction. Since people are saving, they are consuming less. The price of consumer goods drops, as is happening now. If nominal wages remain unchanged, then real wages rise, and therefore entrepreneurs receive the following microeconomic signal. Labor is more expensive, so you should replace workers at the margin with computers and capital equipment. And this is precisely what the new investment projects furthest from consumption are producing. Therefore, in the case of genuine saving, the Ricardo effect strengthens the signal, which communicates to entrepreneurs that they are doing the right thing by lengthening the productive structure with more stages. It also tells them that they will be able to complete their projects, because productive factors freed from the consumption stage can be used to produce those tractors, computers, machines, etc. And finally, we talked about the fifth effect, which involves the interest rate. In the entire process based on credit expansion, once new money has been injected, interest rates go back up, not just to pre-expansion levels, but to higher levels, because they include a positive component for expected inflation. I did not mention it the other day, but they even include a higher positive component for risk, because after the bubble, the perception of risk is much keener. Consequently, the gross market interest rate skyrockets, and since the present value of a capital good is equal to the value of its expected future flow of rents, discounted by the interest rate, remember we looked at the formula, when the interest rate rises, the present value drops to a fraction of its former amount, and this acts as a definitive sign to entrepreneurs that they should not devote their main efforts to producing capital goods, but rather to stages closer to consumption. In contrast, if the process rests on saving, then, because the supply of present goods in terms of future goods is greater, we are willing to give up the present in exchange for a lower premium in the form of interest. Other things being equal, an increase in saving is always reflected in a lower interest rate, which greatly increases the present value of the future flow of rents of any piece of capital equipment, be it a machine, a car, a tractor, a computer, or a facility, a factory, or an apartment. Since the interest rate is in the denominator of the formula, as interest rates fall, present values rise, which tells entrepreneurs that the way to make money is by producing those capital goods which correspond to the stages furthest from consumption. Therefore, when the process is based on genuine saving, none of the factors that halt artificial credit expansion operate. And that process of establishing a productive structure that is more capital intensive, in that it comes to include more numerous and more complex stages, stages which were not considered profitable before, but are considered to be so now, under the new circumstances, since there are more savings available at lower interest rates, that is the healthiest and most favorable process of sustainable economic development imaginable. Furthermore, once those stages are completed, they will permit consumer goods and services in much greater quantity and quality to reach consumers. And with that, economic development will be strengthened, and it will increase and spread to the advantage of all citizens. Now we will consider the possibility of delaying the advent of the crisis, and we will examine the theoretical explanation for the process of inflationary recession, or stagflation. When the fractional reserve banking system initiates the processes of artificial credit expansion, and the corresponding bubble forms, then, after a varying period of time, alarm bells sound. The 6 effects we looked at are gradually triggered, and they stop the euphoria process with a financial crisis, and later a deep economic recession. Many times, when the first warning signs appear, as a rise in the price of productive factors, raw materials, consumer goods, etc., a crisis is not viewed as politically admissible. Things cannot go badly, and thus social pressure is applied on authorities, and even within central banks themselves, in an attempt to solve the problem by giving more alcohol to the patient, who is already beginning to feel the effects of the drinking binge in the form of a hangover. Historically, action has often been taken at the first sign that the whole process of artificial credit expansion is going to collapse, and further doses of credit expansion have been injected, and at a progressively increasing rate. Indeed, with this policy, it is possible to delay the advent of a crisis. But take note, this delay, this postponement of the arrival of the crisis can be achieved only at a great cost. For when the crisis does inevitably hit in the slightly more distant future, it will be much more severe, it will last much longer, and it will involve a much higher social cost. This is because the widespread process of malinvestment which takes place will be far more profound and extensive. I want to emphasize this point, because this is precisely what happened in the last crisis. In the 1990s, there was a tremendous process of credit expansion. These were the roaring Clinton years, and the expansion process inevitably distorted the productive structure, with widespread malinvestments around the world. They started coming to light in the year 2000 or early 2001, in which all the effects we have studied were triggered, and a process of financial crisis and economic recession began. Under normal circumstances, it would have been at that time that we would have had to tackle the restructuring of all the erroneous projects launched in the previous decade. But a historical accident put an end to the entire restructuring process. It was the September 2001 terrorist attack on the World Trade Center. At that time, the world's political and monetary authorities decided that, under such circumstances, the United States could not afford an economic recession. The pressure was brutal, and Alan Greenspan, then chairman of the Federal Reserve, did an about-face in his monetary policy, and interest rates, which had risen to 6%, were lowered to 1% over a few days. In other words, just when the economy was beginning to experience the effects of the recession and enter the healthy readjustment stage it involves, the readjustment was brutally halted by a massive injection of additional credit expansion, a dose increasing at a very rapid pace. Consequently, all of the readjustments which should have been made during that period were postponed. To the widespread malinvestments accumulated over the 90s were added, increasingly and systematically, new widespread malinvestments financed with credit expansion injected into the system at a very rapid pace, starting in 2001. The crisis and recession were postponed. The party was extended, so to speak, and lasted until 2007. But at what cost? Well, starting in 2007, despite the injections of credit expansion, the economic organism triggered the 6 effects we have studied, and with them, the severest financial crisis and economic recession to devastate the world since the Great Depression. If the effects are to be temporarily postponed, the injections of credit must also progressively increase, so that economic agents are surprised by them and unable to predict the influence they will have. For if credit expansion stops or slows down, the 6 effects we have studied are triggered, along with the financial crisis and economic recession. And even if the process of credit expansion does not stop or slow down, even if it grows at a steady rate, to the extent that economic agents can predict it, the 6 effects still appear. And if this happens, a situation can arise in which all of the characteristics typical of a financial crisis and an economic recession are accompanied by a dramatic decrease in the purchasing power of the monetary unit, or if you prefer, an increase in prices. This, dear students, is the worst of worlds. The worst of worlds is one in which we have a profound financial crisis and a serious economic recession with high unemployment, like we have now, but also, and this is not present now, severe inflation, a significant rise in prices, or if you prefer, a great decrease in the purchasing power of the monetary unit. This combination of an economic recession and inflation is called stag, from stagnation, flation, from inflation, stagflation, which in Spanish we will call recesión inflacionaria, inflationary recession. Today we are in the grip of a deep recession, but fortunately we have the euro, and we are not suffering from stagflation, which is the worst of worlds, and into which we could fall if we now attempted to overcome the crisis with a progressively increasing injection of new credit expansion. Historically, there have been instances of stagflation, or inflationary recessions. Think of the profound economic recession and high unemployment that marked the poorly named oil crisis of the 1970s, which was not really an oil crisis. It was the market's natural response to the assault of monetary and credit expansion stemming from the global, but particularly the American, financing of the Vietnam War. There was an environment of great monetary growth. I was young, but I followed the events closely. I was just becoming a teenager. It was a stage of deep economic recession and high levels of inflation, an inflationary recession which clashed with the thinking of macroeconomists in general, and Keynesians in particular, and which went a long way toward discarding the entire Keynesian toolbox of concepts. And what happens if authorities and central banks do not want a crisis to arise under any circumstances, and at the slightest sign of one, they continuously and systematically always inject more money? Well, then we face the possibility of a scenario that has played out before in history. The quantity of money injected into the system grows so much that eventually runaway inflation follows and does away with the monetary system. A case in point is the hyperinflation that devastated Germany in the 1920s. Different economists have examined this process. The most important treatise on the subject is The Economics of Inflation by the Italian professor Bresciani Torroni, who explores in detail the hyperinflation process that ravaged Germany after World War I. Throughout the 1920s, when monetary growth was such that banknote printing factories operated at full capacity for shifts of 8 hours, without ever stopping during the day. They could not produce money fast enough. In fact, the value of the mark fell to a practically irrelevant fraction of its former worth. I have a few of these marks at home. The smallest denomination was 1 million marks, which would perhaps be equal to 1 euro cent. In nominal terms, all workers were multi-billionaires. They were earning tens of billions of marks, but a loaf of bread cost 100 million marks. A time came when hyperinflation was so severe that the first people in line paid one price for bread and the last in line paid another 2 or 3 times higher. What happened in the end? The mark lost all of its value, and people naturally and spontaneously began to make exchanges using other monetary systems, stamps, cigarettes, etc. And before that, a monetary reform was introduced and triggered the 6 effects, along with a very deep recession, grave social discontent, high unemployment, etc. These events set the stage for the democratic victory of Nazism in Germany. And since the Germans have historical memory, they rightly attribute Hitler's rise to power, together with all the accompanying tragedies for their country and the rest of Europe, to the prior stage of hyperinflation. And for that reason, following World War II, they incorporated into their constitution a mandate to maintain monetary stability. In that constitution, the objective of preserving monetary stability is established for the German central bank. In no case is it to promote economic growth, which is a euphemism for promoting artificial credit expansion. This is the main distinction between the monetary policy of Europe and that of the United States and England, where the respective central banks do take on the responsibility of keeping the economy thriving. And this provides them with an excuse to orchestrate continual expansions of credit, which, as we have seen, seriously distort the economic process. In a way, following the Maastricht Treaty, the European Monetary Union has inherited this constitutional mandate issued to the Bundesbank, which explains why Euro monetary policy, though not free from grave errors, has been less wild and volatile than its American and English counterparts. Section 4 deals with forced saving and the self-destructive nature of the artificial booms credit expansion causes. There are 2 concepts of forced saving. The loose concept refers to the income redistribution process which always follows monetary growth. I illustrated this to you here in class in the last course with a simulation game, and I give the same demonstration each year. I bring in some cash, a roll of bank bills, and we design 2 different plans for injecting money into society, which, for our purposes, we suppose consists of the members of the class. We begin with Friedman's famous helicopter drop, which is actually a copy of an argument used centuries earlier by David Hume. The argument involves the equal, uniform distribution of newly created money among all citizens. Regarding this process, Hume asks what would happen if all British citizens woke up one morning to find the cash balances in their pockets had doubled. Would they be wealthier? Would the quantity of capital equipment, tractors, factories and consumer goods, etc. have increased? No. People would simply have more monetary units. Everyone would be making purchases with those monetary units, and eventually the effect would be that the purchasing power of the monetary unit would fall, and prices would rise. Everyone would be in more or less the same situation as before. Authorities, economic theorists and central bankers never think of suggesting an injection of money distributed equally among all citizens, and it would be extremely easy to do. Banks would simply be instructed to double everybody's balances. The trick behind monetary injections lies in the fact that when they take place, only a few people initially receive the new money. It is injected into specific gaps in the economic system. And in the simulation game, specific students receive it. And in an intratemporal view, so to speak, of the economic process, these students perhaps correspond to particular sectors. A few subsidies here, a few builders there, granted loans in some specific place. And in the case of an intertemporal process, which gives rise to a bubble and later a crisis, those who benefit are the privileged people who first receive the newly created loans. A process of income redistribution follows, because those who first receive the new purchasing power are able to acquire productive factors and consumer goods and services at prices that do not yet reflect the whole impact of the injection of new money. Meanwhile, the rest of the citizens, who have not yet received the new money, Because, I repeat, it has not been equally distributed among all citizens, watch hopelessly, or maybe they fail to notice, as prices begin to rise, while their incomes remain the same. In short, there is a process of income redistribution, in which some people, the first to receive the new monetary units, come out ahead at the expense of the rest of the citizens, who lose out. So, all of these people who are harmed illustrate what we could conceptualize or define as forced saving in a loose sense. All of the citizens who do not receive the money initially, and who watch as the purchasing power of their monetary units drops and drops, are forced to save. They cannot buy as much as before, while others benefit, because they are the first to receive the money. So the loose concept of forced saving entails this process of income redistribution. Well, in theoretical terms, we cannot postulate with complete accuracy that the final result will be an increase or a decrease in net saving. That will depend on the proportion in which those who benefit and those who are harmed decide to save and consume. At any rate, every incentive certainly encourages capital consumption and a decrease in saving. Now, our theory of the cycle already contains a stricter definition of forced saving, and it refers to the widespread malinvestment which occurs in the different stages financed with credit expansion and not genuine saving. To give you a visual idea, I explained this malinvestment the other day using charts with shaded bars, corresponding to new, previously non-existent stages financed with credit expansion, the 6th and the 7th stages, and to the widening of existent stages that were relatively more distant from consumption, the 4th and the 5th stages. Entrepreneurs see a mirage of profits in all of these stages, and they devote to them their investment efforts, which are financed with artificial credit expansion. Widespread malinvestment results and gives rise to forced saving in a strict sense. And in the end, the market, which is highly efficient in dynamic terms, inevitably uncovers this malinvestment embodied in forced saving and reverses it via the 6 processes we have studied. First with a financial crisis in fractional reserve banking, and then a deep economic recession. Now let us discuss unemployment, a subject which interests me very much. It is covered in section 6. Well, unemployment, or to be more precise, the massive unemployment of productive factors, has 2 causes. One cause is immediate or direct, and the other is mediate or indirect, though no less significant. In fact, it is even more so. The immediate or direct cause of unemployment or joblessness is always that labor markets are very rigid. In the market, a force driven by entrepreneurs' desire for profit leads to the setting of a market price for each good and service, and this price falls between what is known as the subjective valuations of the marginal pairs. If an artificial price higher than the market price is imposed by the coercive power of the state, at that higher price it is to entrepreneurs' advantage to produce much more, because in theory they are guaranteed sales at a very high price, and yet those who demand the good or want to buy it, the consumers, demand less at such a high price. When an artificial price is set higher than the one that would emerge in the spontaneous free market order, the problem of an unsold surplus immediately arises. That is, when an artificially high price is set. For example, imagine the price of potatoes is 10 euros a kilo. If some state authority says 20 euros a kilo, entrepreneurs will rush to produce potatoes. But at 20 euros a kilo, many consumers will stop demanding them. As a result, the market will be flooded with unsold potatoes. Apply the same economic reasoning, mutatis mutandis, to the services of the labor factor, that is, workers. If a price, called a wage, is set for the services of labor, and this price exceeds the one the market would set, then there will be many more people who wish to work than entrepreneurs who demand workers, and there will be very high unemployment. Therefore, the immediate cause of unemployment is that labor markets are not free. They are tremendously rigidified by a snarled mess of poorly named labor laws, which are simply a group of government commands that prevent economic agents from making the deals they believe are most beneficial to them in the sphere of the labor market. These laws establish a minimum wage higher than the wage the market would set, and they are especially harmful to the least productive. That is, the young people who for the first time are entering the labor market, and to marginalized minorities, women, immigrants, who are hit particularly hard by unemployment. Thus, it should not surprise us that nearly 50% of young Spanish people are unemployed, due to an entirely rigid labor market bequeathed to us by the Franco regime. This rigid market rests on a tangled mess of regulations that establish minimum wages and prevent the negotiation of terms of dismissal, should it become necessary to conclude a work relationship, etc. No democratic party, since the arrival of democracy, has dared to dismantle it. That is why Spain has traditionally had the highest level of unemployment of all the countries in its economic area. And I am not referring only to the legal task of establishing labor prices, that is, wages, which exceed market prices, but also to union pressure and coercion aimed at keeping wages artificially high, and to the entire snarled mess of employment legislation, which makes hiring a worker a much larger commitment nowadays than marrying someone. Ever since divorce became quick and easy, it has been much easier to get a divorce than to fire someone. And entrepreneurs take into account not only the extra economic costs stemming from the imposition of this whole tangle of labor market legislation, but also the economic costs stemming from all the suffering, all the problems arising from the judicialization of dismissal, and all the problems involved in labor relations in a workplace which has been artificially transformed into a trade union battlefield, in which it is impossible to work comfortably, etc. As a result, there are a vast number of unemployed people whenever the labor market is rigid and not free. That said, while the immediate or direct cause of unemployment is always labor market rigidity or inflexibility, there is a much more serious, if that is possible, mediate or indirect cause of unemployment, and that is precisely inflation, or to be more exact, the artificial process of credit expansion. For if a process of artificial credit expansion is instigated and lasts for a somewhat prolonged period of time, we already know, based on economic theory, that this leads to a widespread misallocation of millions of workers, who are assigned to investment projects that are unviable in the long term. And since the market is highly efficient, and it sooner or later uncovers these investment errors, what immediately happens when the 6 effects we have studied are triggered? Well, we discover that all those projects are unviable, that they were undertaken in error, but the problems already exist. The damage has already been done. Workers have already been sent to produce what should not have been produced, to build what should not have been built, etc. And now it is time for the hard, difficult, arduous chore of transferring on a massive scale those workers and scarce factors of production from where they are and should not be to where they should go, which is to radically different lines of production, profitable ones. And clearly, if 5 million workers must be transferred from one place to another, and the labor market is not very flexible, we can all see that these workers will remain unemployed for a very prolonged period of time. So, if we wish to combat unemployment, we must make 2 measures. First, we must avoid under all circumstances the initiation of processes that lead to widespread malinvestment, and thus to a misallocation of the labor factor. For inevitably, sooner or later, it will become obvious that a restructuring is necessary, and on the level of individuals, families and society, it is always painful. Perhaps I have moved to Vigo to participate in an entrepreneurial project, and I have taken my entire family with me. But now it turns out I am being laid off, because that project is unviable, and I have to go back to Murcia with only the clothes on my back. If I had known what was going to happen, I would never have made the erroneous decision to go. So we must prevent and block credit expansion, the mediate cause of malinvestment, of the misallocation of the labor factor, and therefore, ultimately, of unemployment, which calls for a temporary process of reallocation or readjustment of productive factors. Second, once an error has been made, it is vital that labor markets be as flexible as possible, because then the reallocation of workers, though painful and requiring of sacrifice, will be much faster. It is like when someone pulls off a band-aid, little by little. Ouch! One hair, and another, and another. Don't be an idiot. What you have to do is pull it off all at once. Ah! It'll be so fast you won't feel a thing. If labour markets are flexible, the readjustment process is very fast. There is much less suffering, and the social cost is much lower. So, now you know the two causes of unemployment and what you must do to combat it. Now we come to section 9, which I think is beautifully titled. Note the heading of this section. The policy of general price level stabilization and its destabilizing effects on the economy. There are periods in history when, due to the introduction of new technologies, the sharpening of the entrepreneurial spirit, the entrance of increasing numbers of the population into economic circuits, as a combined result of all of these factors, productivity, that is, the production of goods and services, increases dramatically. Such a set of circumstances existed in the 1920s, for instance. Henry Ford introduced a brilliant entrepreneurial innovation, assembly line production. Until then, cars had been made one by one, to order. Now they were mass-produced. Consequently, what happened? Costs fell. Many more cars were produced, and what had been a luxury item reserved for millionaires became a mass consumer good for the working middle class, the Ford Model T. Similar circumstances existed in the last decade of the 20th century and the first few years of the 21st. Such major innovations as the Internet and new communications technologies were adopted. And above all, over 1 billion people who had been outside the market went to work in a market economy in China and in India. This led to an enormous increase in production. Dear students, when these factors are present, there is such a rise in the quantity and quality of goods and services produced that, other things being equal, the price per unit tends to fall. Well, this process in which more is produced at lower and lower prices is the healthiest and most favorable form of economic development, because even if we earn the same amount, what we buy costs us less and less. For example, in the field of technology, I remember the first personal computer I ever purchased, back around 1985, one of the first ones to arrive in Spain. It cost me several million pesetas at the time, which would be like 25,000 euros today. Actually, if we take inflation into account, it would be more like 50,000 euros today. How many personal computers can I buy today with 50,000 euros? 50. And each one of them with at least 100 times more capacity than the one I bought in 1985. What does this mean? It means that due to technological innovations and the increase in productivity, the unit price of this product has not stopped declining. Well, in periods like these, in which productivity rises so much and prices should drop, many economists insist that the purchasing power of the monetary unit must be kept stable. In other words, that we must prevent prices from falling. Thus, in the 1920s, and in the years surrounding the end of the last century and the beginning of the current one, when this huge increase in productivity should have led to a very significant decrease in unit prices, though to a greater or a lesser extent, depending on the good in question, it turns out that under the pretext of keeping the purchasing power of the monetary unit constant, that is, preventing the purchasing power of the monetary unit from increasing as a result of a decrease in prices, authorities reacted by injecting on a massive scale the money necessary to keep prices from falling, to keep them stable. Well, in contexts of mounting productivity, so-called stabilization policies have extremely harmful destabilizing effects. To begin with, they conceal what is really happening from citizens. In the 1920s, and in recent years before our current crisis, prices did not rise much, and hence politicians and citizens thought a perpetual virtuous cycle had been reached, when in fact the system was undergoing an expansion of credit the likes of which had not been seen for decades. Credit was being injected into the system to offset the marked decrease in prices, which, in the absence of interference, would have followed the increase in productivity. The increase in productivity offered the excuse for injecting inflation with impunity. In other circumstances, with no increase in productivity, the injection of credit expansion could not have been so far-reaching, because its effects would have been noticed sooner. But in such long periods of rising productivity, as I have mentioned, the 1920s and the years surrounding the change of century, an increasing rate of credit expansion was kept up for over a decade because citizens did not perceive it in the form of a rise in prices. It was specialists alone, those who were aware of the high growth in productivity, who knew that a more or less stable price level could be maintained only at the expense of a huge injection of money. This injection was not noticeable in the form of an increase in the unit prices of consumer goods and services, but it was noticeable in the prices of productive factors, capital goods, and the securities that represent them in the stock market. During the period of irrational exuberance, these prices rose continually. Sensible economists sounded the alarm, but no one listened to us. People said, "Not to worry, what does it matter? Prices are rising on the stock market because things are going very well. Anyway, look at the prices of consumer goods. They are not going up." We told them they should have gone down, and significantly, due to the large increase in productivity. The fact that they are not going up reveals the severe monetary distortion the system is causing. And even if unit prices do not rise, the vigorous and growing credit expansion that has been injected into the system under the pretext of stabilizing the purchasing power of the monetary unit has not failed to have its effect in the form of widespread malinvestments. And in the end, the 6 effects we studied have appeared in the shape of an acute financial crisis and economic recession. Indeed, we have already seen the first effect, growth in the price of the factors of production and raw materials. Remember that the price of oil skyrocketed in 2007 before everything collapsed. What did we say the second effect was? More than proportional growth in the price of consumer goods. We have not observed this effect in this most recent cycle, nor was it observed in the 1920s. However, it has ultimately been replaced by something that is essentially the same thing. Even if prices per unit have not risen, production has increased so much that the sales of consumer goods companies, equal to the unit price times the number of units sold, have gone through the roof, and thus the largest profits have arisen in consumer rather than in capital industries. This is the third effect, which tells entrepreneurs, you have made a mistake, you have invested in the wrong place, and you must move toward consumer companies. There is great demand for labor. The fourth effect, the Ricardo effect, appears. The 6 effects are triggered all the same, and they give rise to a financial crisis and an economic recession that leaves macroeconomists scratching their heads. They cannot understand how such a turn of events could have come about when we appeared to have entered a never-ending virtuous cycle, the best of worlds, in which there was no inflation. Prices were more or less stable. And what is more, we were getting rich as if by magic, simply by purchasing on the stock market, or buying apartments or real estate, and waiting and watching as our assets went up in value month after month. Notice that economic theory is a toolbox of concepts that enable us to comprehend what we cannot see, which is what matters. A good economist is one who can understand what is invisible, what is not obvious. So our entire theory tallies perfectly with those processes of rising productivity, and policies of stabilizing the purchasing power of the monetary unit are profoundly destabilizing. The same was true in the 1920s, the roaring 20s of the Great Gatsby, when everything was going well. The stock market kept rising. Prices were not going up. People said the same thing, that we had reached a virtuous cycle for a permanently high plateau. And yet the seeds were being sown for an immensely severe financial crisis and recession. Extremely strong similarities exist between this period and the one we have just lived through, and which has ended in the current financial crisis and economic recession. Be sure to read the list of financial crises and economic recessions at the end of the chapter. There is a quick mention of those we have studied from the time of the Greeks and the Middle Ages, but mainly the list focuses on all the financial crises to have hit since the arrival of the Industrial Revolution at the beginning of the 19th century. And you will see that, surprisingly, they all follow practically the same pattern, or a very similar pattern. Analyze them, because they are laid out for you, paragraph by paragraph. It is very important that you read about them.